So whenever we look back at historical conflicts, especially those, massive ancient clashes that have been passed down for centuries, we are just heavily conditioned to frame them as straightforward battles for a throne.
Right, yeah. It's always framed as a simple binary. One king is sitting in the big chair, and another guy wants to unseat him so he can sit in the big chair.
Exactly. Like, the narrative we're fed usually operates on this very basic level. It's just a high-stakes game of musical chairs played by a tiny fraction of elites.
Yeah, the faces on the coins change, the banners hanging from the palace change, but the actual architecture, the throne, remains completely untouched.
And the people being crushed underneath the weight of that throne, they barely notice the difference.
No, not at all.
Which brings us right into the core of our deep dive today. If you are joining us, our mission is to completely rewire how you understand the mechanics of power. We're looking at a really dense, highly analytical lecture delivered by Alama Parvez in 1981.
Right, and he's focusing on a specific segment of text Surah Ayat 30 through 45. And Parvez takes the story of Moses and Pharaoh and just completely flips the traditional Game of Thrones narrative on its head.
Yeah, he makes a very compelling case that this was not a political coup, and it definitely was not some, supernatural fairy tale involving magic wands and angry deities.
I mean, he effectively strips away all the centuries of theological mythology that usually obscure this story. Instead of treating it as a Sunday school lesson, he approaches the text as like a masterclass in socioeconomics and political science.
And he focuses on this highly specific, really intense moment in Pharaoh's court. It's a debate about how to handle Moses, and a single individual, an insider within Pharaoh's own establishment, stands up.
The text refers to him as a believer, and he methodically deconstructs the state's propaganda in real time, right there in front of the cabinet.
Let's really unpack the psychology of that moment, because the core argument this insider makes is it's surprisingly modern. Throughout history, if you look at any revolution, the immediate accusation from the people in power is always that the revolutionaries are just power-hungry.
Right, the establishment is like, they don't care about you, they just want my job.
Exactly. And in this scene, Pharaoh stands up in front of his cabinet and accuses Moses of exactly that.
Yeah.
He claims Moses is just running this sophisticated political campaign to steal the throne. But the counter-argument that Parvez extracts from this insider is wild.
It really is. The insider points out that Moses has absolutely zero interest in becoming the new pharaoh.
Which, Pharaoh's brain literally lacks the capacity to process that concept.
Right, because a tyrant looks at the world through a strictly hierarchical lens. To him, power is just a zero-sum game of domination. He assumes Moses wants to replace him because replacing the guy at the top is the only category of revolution that even exists in Pharaoh's mental framework.
But the insider points out the flaw there. Replacing one human ruler with another human ruler who demands the exact same subjugation. That's just parallel tyranny.
Yeah, and Parvez makes a really fascinating linguistic move here in the source material. He takes the term shirk, which is almost exclusively translated in traditional circles as a religious term meaning, idolatry or worshiping statues, and he defines it in a strictly political and sociological sense.
That feels like a massive redefinition for anyone familiar with the traditional text. So in this framework, political idolatry isn't about bowing to a literal stone statue.
No, not at all. It's about bowing to another human being's arbitrary authority.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the argument is that submitting to arbitrary human authority is the ultimate form of idolatry because it violates the natural order of human equality.
So if Moses were to, gather an army, march into the palace, overthrow Pharaoh, and then sit on that exact same throne demanding forced labor in his own name.
He would be committing that exact same political shirk. He would just be the newest idol in the temple of state power.
Right, so Parvez is saying the actual mission wasn't to capture the throne, but to completely dismantle the system of human-over-human subjugation.
Exactly. The goal was to replace the arbitrary dictates of a single ruler with a system of universal, rationally governed law. A system where absolutely no human being functions as the ultimate master of another.
I want you, the listener, to picture this like a modern corporate hostile takeover, because it makes the disconnect so clear. Pharaoh thinks Moses is a rival executive who just wants to be the new CEO of Egypt Incorporated.
Right. He thinks Moses wants the corner office and the massive bonuses.
Exactly. But Moses is actually trying to dissolve the corporation entirely. He wants to turn it into a worker-owned cooperative based on universal bylaws where the CEO position doesn't even exist anymore.
How does a tyrant sitting in that corner office even comprehend a threat like that? You can't fight an enemy who doesn't even value the prize you are desperately trying to defend.
Yeah, Pharaoh is barricading the door to his corner office, and Moses is outside handing out sledgehammers to take down the load-bearing walls of the entire building.
That's a great way to put it. And the insider in the parliament is trying to explain this disconnect to the rest of the cabinet. He is essentially saying, you are trying to prosecute this man for a crime he isn't committing.
Right, like, he's not after your jobs. He's trying to warn you that the company itself is fundamentally insolvent.
Exactly. The foundation is rotten, and the entire structure is going to crash completely regardless of who sits in the CEO's chair.
And that warning brings us to one of the most crucial structural shifts in Parwaz's entire analysis. It's how we are supposed to understand the consequences of a corrupt system.
This is where the deep dive gets really profound, I think.
Yeah, because usually when we read these ancient texts, the fall of a corrupt society is framed as supernatural retribution. The narrative is always, the society is bad, a deity gets angry at them, and a magical lightning bolt strikes the city down.
Right, it's framed as entirely external.
But Parwaz completely strips away that supernatural framing. He argues that's a total misreading of how the universe actually operates.
Well, because the supernatural framing is actually a way of avoiding accountability. If a society falls because of a magical lightning bolt, then the collapse is just arbitrary.
Right, you couldn't have seen it coming.
Exactly. But Parwaz redefines divine punishment entirely into a rational socioeconomic principle. He argues that societies are not destroyed by magical interventions from the sky. They are destroyed by the inexorable, rational, mathematical laws of cause and effect.
It operates with the same reliability as physics or chemistry. And let's bring in the specific analogy Parwaz uses in the lecture, because I think it perfectly bridges that gap between abstract sociology and hard science.
The arsenic analogy.
Yes. If you're listening, think about how poisons actually work on a biological level.
Right, so arsenic is a naturally occurring chemical element. It has inherent physical properties that interact with human biology in very specific, predictable ways. Parwaz points out that if a medical professional uses a microscopic, perfectly calibrated drop of arsenic in a specific context, it can actually have medicinal properties.
But if a person consumes a handful of arsenic, it kills them.
Right.
But the crucial detail to focus on here is why the person dies. When someone eats a handful of arsenic and their organs shut down, we don't say the universe got angry at them.
No, we don't say a deity arbitrarily struck them down to punish them for their dietary choices. The person dies because they violated the physical limits of the substance.
They crossed a strict threshold of cause and effect. The arsenic isn't angry.
No, the arsenic is simply doing what arsenic mathematically does when it reaches a certain concentration in the bloodstream. The biological system collapses because the inputs dictated a collapse.
So if we take that out of the chemistry lab and apply it to a civilization, I have to ask, what does a socioeconomic fatal dose of arsenic actually look like?
It looks exactly like the structure of Pharaoh's Egypt, or honestly, any system throughout history that relies on the extreme subjugation and exploitation of the masses just to feed a tiny bloated elite at the top.
So an unjust socioeconomic system inherently breeds its own destruction.
Absolutely. When you build an economy on forced labor, artificial scarcity, and extreme wealth hoarding, you create massive societal friction. You stifle human potential and breed deep structural resentment.
You are fundamentally destabilizing the foundation of the society. So the society isn't being murdered by an angry deity from the outside?
Yeah, it is committing systemic suicide.
Systemic suicide. Let that sink in. The collapse is entirely self-inflicted.
The rulers are basically gorging themselves on economic arsenic, completely ignorant of the fact that the fatal dose is a mathematical inevitability.
So when the insider in the parliament is speaking up, he is essentially warning them, Moses isn't going to destroy us. Our own systemic oppression is going to destroy us.
Right. Moses is just the diagnostic tool pointing out that they have already ingested the fatal dose.
I do struggle with this concept a little bit, though. Let's look at it practically. If oppressive systems are basically feeding themselves poison, why do they often look so incredibly stable and powerful from the outside, right up until the literal moment they collapse?
That's a great question.
Think about Pharaoh's Egypt. You have the Great Pyramids, massive standing armies, a seemingly unbreakable grip on power. If I'm walking through ancient Egypt, I don't see a society on the brink of suicide. I see an invincible empire. How does Parwaz reconcile that inevitable collapse with the illusion of stability?
Well, the illusion of absolute power is one of the most fascinating sociological phenomena Parwaz tackles. What looks like stability to the untrained eye is often just rigidity.
Rigidity.
Yeah, think of a massive old tree that has become completely rigid and brittle. It looks immense and unmovable, but because it cannot bend, it will violently snap in a storm, whereas a younger, flexible tree survives.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Oppressive systems look incredibly strong precisely because they use immense, brutal force to suppress the symptoms of the poison. They crush the protests, they silence the critics, they build massive monuments specifically designed to project an aura of invincibility.
But the rot is internal.
Exactly. The poison is quietly working its way through the organs of the state, degrading the actual infrastructure of the society beneath the shiny veneer.
They are essentially masking the symptoms with heavy painkillers, while the arsenic actively shuts down their liver. The patient feels completely fine, right up until they drop dead.
And this leads directly into Parwaz's critique of the psychological architecture required to maintain that illusion. How do these power structures actually keep the populace and themselves from realizing they are drinking poison?
Because you can't just subjugate millions of people purely with swords forever. Swords are expensive and exhausting to swing.
Right. Eventually, you need to control the narrative. You need a psychological apparatus. And Parwaz points out this concept of the iron curtain of arrogance. The specific term he analyzes from the source material is takabu.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
It translates roughly to an extreme, blinding arrogance or haughtiness. But Parwaz doesn't treat takabur merely as a personal character flaw of a single tyrant. He analyzes it as a structural necessity for the survival of a tyranny.
A structural necessity. So they have to be arrogant to survive.
Yes. A tyrant must institutionalize this arrogance. They have to erect an iron curtain around their administration to aggressively block out any rational critique, any contradictory data, any empirical evidence that the system is actually failing.
It's the ultimate state-sponsored echo chamber. If you are listening to this, think about the worst corporate culture you've ever experienced, where the leadership completely isolates themselves from the reality of the factory floor.
The isolation is a defense mechanism. If you are the supreme ruler, your entire claim to power depends on your perceived infallibility. Your word must be law, and the law must be perfect.
Therefore, anyone who brings you bad news, anyone who points out the mathematical inevitability of the systemic collapse, cannot be viewed as a helpful advisor.
Right, because if they are right, your infallibility is broken. So the system is designed to treat any warning as an existential threat. The tyrant processes any rational critique as an insult from an inferior.
So when Moses, or the believer in the parliament, brings forward a completely rational, evidence-based argument that the economic model is unsustainable, Pharaoh literally cannot process the information as logic.
No, his psychological architecture forces him to process it strictly as insubordination. The arrogance creates this impenetrable cognitive dissonance.
Because the elites look at their own hoarded wealth and their massive palaces, and they convince themselves that their comfort is empirical proof that the system works perfectly.
Exactly. They ignore the fact that the palace is built on a powder keg. But eventually, the laws of physics catch up. Rational arguments do start to corner a tyrant. The public starts to murmur, the friction increases, and the cracks in the foundation become visible even through the Iron Curtain.
And that is the pivotal moment. When the logic gets too tight, when the math becomes undeniable, the tyrant doesn't respond with a better logical argument or a new economic policy.
No, they respond with massive theatrical distraction. And this is where we have to talk about one of the most critical figures in this entire narrative. Haman.
Yes, the Haman factor. The inclusion of Haman in Parwaz's analysis is perhaps his sharpest and most relevant critique for modern listeners, I think.
Absolutely. In the traditional version of the story, Haman is usually brushed off as just Pharaoh's sidekick, maybe his chief architect, or just a loyal minister who follows orders.
But structurally and sociologically, Parwaz argues that Haman represents something much more systemic and insidious: the religious and ideological establishment.
He represents the weaponization of belief systems. When Pharaoh is finally cornered in the debate by Moses' rational arguments about systemic justice, Pharaoh doesn't try to debate economics. He pivots entirely.
He turns to Haman and issues a very specific, bizarre public order. He tells Haman to build a high tower so that Pharaoh can climb up to the heavens and look for Moses' God.
Right, and if you just read that on the surface, it sounds completely absurd. It sounds like the plot of a cartoon villain.
Building a brick tower to find a deity in the clouds, it's nuts.
It sounds absurd if you take it literally, but Parwaz argues this is not just a tyrant mocking a revolutionary, it is a highly calculated, desperate political maneuver.
So the tyrant knows he's losing the battle of logic. He knows the economic realities are turning against him.
Yes. So he shifts the battleground from the rational to the mystical and the theatrical. He utilizes the religious elite to manufacture a distraction for the masses.
The message to the public basically becomes, don't look at the failing economy, don't look at the forced labor, don't look at the fact that we are hoarding all the wealth. Instead, look at this massive, holy infrastructure project.
Exactly. So Haman isn't just an architect building a physical tower. He is the head of the PR department and the chief legal loophole creator rolled into one.
The tower is a massive state-funded distraction designed to keep the public's eyes pointed at the sky while their pockets are being picked on the ground.
It's the classic bread and circuses strategy, but dressed up in sacred robes. The theatricality is the point. And Parwez goes incredibly deep into the economic critique of this clergy class.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Yeah, he argues that the religious elite the institution Haman represents actively block structural, rational change because their entire livelihood depends on the corrupt system remaining intact.
Right. Their prestige, their massive wealth, their monopoly on truth, it all relies on Pharaoh staying in power. If Moses succeeds in dismantling the hierarchy, Haman is out of a job.
Because if the law is universal, rational, and accessible to everyone, you no longer need an elite class of gatekeepers to interpret the mysteries of the universe for you.
So the religious elite act as a deliberate barrier to a just society specifically to protect their monopoly on wealth.
Exactly. And Parwez provides a very concrete historical example of how this ideological establishment operates to maintain the status quo. He points out that they create fake, overly complex legal frameworks to justify exploiting the public while making it look pious.
Right. The specific example he analyzes from the source text is the manipulation of the concept of riba. Let's really spend some time unpacking riba, because if we want to understand how the Haman factor actually operates in the real world, this is the perfect mechanism to look at.
At its core, riba is fundamentally the extraction of wealth from the labor of others without contributing equal value. It encompasses extreme economic exploitation, predatory lending, and the hoarding of wealth to create artificial scarcity.
It is the mechanism by which the rich get richer, simply by leveraging the desperation of the poor.
Right. In Parwez's framework, a rational, just society would strictly outlaw this practice because riba is the fast-acting version of that socioeconomic arsenic we talked about earlier. It aggressively degrades the working class in order to artificially inflate the elite.
But the elite obviously want to keep doing it because it's highly profitable. So what does the religious or ideological establishment do? They can't just come out and say, yes, we are actively exploiting you and we don't care.
The public would revolt. So they rebrand it. They obscure the mechanism. Parwez points out that the establishment takes riba and simply renames it.
They call it profit sharing, or they create incredibly complex, seemingly pious legal loopholes that allow the exact same extractive mechanism to continue just under a holy-sounding name.
They take systemic theft and paint a thick veneer of sanctity over it. And the complexity of the new law is the point. It confuses the public into thinking the exploitation is actually a divine mystery that only the elites can understand.
This keeps the wealth flowing rapidly upward, while convincing the masses that the economic hierarchy is divinely ordained and therefore cannot be challenged. That is incredibly cynical, but it makes perfect sense from a survival standpoint.
It's the perfect symbiotic relationship of oppression. Pharaoh provides the brute military force and the state apparatus to keep the system in place, and Haman provides the ideological anesthetic to keep the people from realizing they're being poisoned.
Pharaoh holds the sword, and Haman hands out the painkillers. It is the perfect synthesis of tyranny.
And this is exactly what the believer in the parliament is trying to expose to the rest of the cabinet. He is holding up a mirror and saying, look at the mechanics of what we are actually doing. We are subjugating millions of people, hoarding wealth, and using massive theatrical distractions to cover up the rot.
Right. This isn't just a moral failing. It is mathematically unsustainable. We are going to collapse. Which naturally brings us to the most vital question of this entire deep dive. If Pharaoh's system is the problem, what is the actual solution?
What is the alternative structural model?
Yes, exactly. Because Parwez isn't just tearing down the old system. He's pointing toward a new one.
The alternative Parwez extracts from the text is a society built entirely on the principle of makafat imal.
Makafat imal. Can we translate that directly?
It translates roughly to the law of proportionate consequence, or, more simply, the law of recompense.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
In direct contrast to Pharaoh's arbitrary rule, where your societal outcomes are dictated by the ruler's mood or your lineage or how much you can bribe the clergy, the proposed positive model is a purely rational society.
It is a system where outcomes are directly and unequivocally tied to actions.
Exactly. It is the socio-economic equivalent of Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
If you're listening, think about what that actually means for a society. It means constructive actions organically yield societal growth. Destructive actions organically yield societal decline.
It's not about who your father was, and it's not about what title you hold. It's strictly about what you actually contribute to the system.
The implications of that are staggering, really,
Yeah.
because implementing Makafati Amal requires a foundational element that was entirely foreign to Pharaoh's Egypt. And, if we are being honest, it remains a foreign concept to many systemic structures operating today. Absolute mathematical structural equality.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because Parwez spends a significant amount of time in this lecture fiercely defending this concept of absolute equality.
He makes a brutal critique of traditional legal interpretations to highlight just how radical this universal law actually is. And he does this specifically by analyzing the legal arguments regarding gender, right?
He does. And this is where Parwez's analysis becomes highly disruptive to the clerical establishments of his own time. He explicitly attacks traditional, clergy-dominated legal rulings to prove a point about how universal law must operate.
Let's get into the specifics of that.
He focuses on the specific legal ruling regarding blood money, which is the financial compensation paid to a victim's family in the event of a murder. In the traditional legal frameworks, largely codified by the ideological elite, the blood money for a murdered woman was legally mandated to be exactly half the value of the blood money for a murdered man.
Let's just pause and let the math of that sink in. Legally, structurally, a woman's life was codified as being worth exactly 50% of a man's life.
Parwez argues that this 50% valuation is an absolute, undeniable violation of the universal law presented in the source material. He states unequivocally that a rational society, a society based on Makafat Amal, cannot mathematically function on a system of tiered human worth.
The universal law dictates absolute equality between men and women as equally valuable human beings.
Exactly, because if you think about the mechanics of it, a system of proportionate consequence only functions if the baseline value of the actors in the system is equal.
Right. If your legal code inherently devalues half of the entire population before they even take a single action, the game is rigged from the start. You have already poisoned the system with arbitrary subjugation.
A system with tiered human worth isn't an alternative to Pharaoh. It's just Pharaoh's system wearing a different mask.
The logic is inescapable. You cannot build a rationally governed, just society on a foundation of structural inequality. The very second a legal or economic system dictates that one group's baseline humanity is worth less than another's, you have reintroduced arbitrary tyranny.
You have reintroduced the political shirk, that political idolatry that we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive. The baseline must be absolute equality, or the natural laws of cause and effect will eventually tear the system apart.
So if the foundation of this new society is absolute baseline equality, how does the economy function? Because we've established that Pharaoh's economic model was pure extraction, hoarding as much wealth at the top as physically possible. What does the rational alternative model say about material wealth?
The rational model fundamentally redefines the purpose and utility of wealth. In an oppressive system like Pharaoh's, wealth is viewed as the final destination. The entire point of a human life is to accumulate as much material wealth as possible, build a massive vault to store it in, and then die.
But in the alternative model Parwez outlines, material wealth is recognized as absolutely necessary, but strictly as a vehicle.
Yes, it is a transit system. It is a means to an end, not the end goal itself.
To make this concrete, Parwez uses a really evocative analogy here, the analogy of the traveler.
The traveler analogy perfectly illustrates the paradigm shift. Parwez says that wealth is like the horse you ride to make a long journey. If you are going to travel effectively, you need a strong, healthy horse.
You need material resources to live a dignified life and to move forward.
Right. But Pharaoh's society makes a fatal categorical error. They believe the goal of life is just to sit on the horse forever in one spot and accumulate a massive herd of millions of other horses that you can't even ride.
While other people have to walk, it's the transition from an extractive economy to a developmental economy. If wealth is the transit system, Hoarding it is the equivalent of buying up every single train car on the tracks and never actually leaving the station.
You are just sitting there proudly hoarding empty train cars while the rest of the population is stuck on the platform, completely unable to travel anywhere.
When you hoard the train cars, you paralyze the entire society. Parwez argues that the true destination of human life, the place that the horse or the train is supposed to actually take you, is a state he refers to as makam e-perwarish.
Makam e-perwarish, which translates roughly to a state of comprehensive human development, nurturing, and the actualization of human potential.
So if we look at this through a modern lens, an economy shouldn't be judged by how many billionaires it can produce at the top. It shouldn't be judged by how high Pharaoh can build his pyramid.
No, a rational economy should be judged solely by how effectively its resources, its horses, are utilized to transport every single member of that society toward their highest physical, intellectual, and social potential.
The metric of success completely changes. If the resources are hoarded at the top, the societal journey halts. The system stagnates.
And as we established with the arsenic analogy, when a system stagnates because it actively refuses to allow its people to develop, it begins to generate massive friction. It begins to synthesize that socioeconomic poison. It begins to die.
The hoarding of wealth isn't just greedy, it is structurally fatal to the society. Let's weave all of these massive concepts together as we synthesize this deep dive. This has been an incredible paradigm shift from the usual way the Moses and Pharaoh conflict is taught.
Truly. We started with the assumption of a simple political coup, but the source material clearly outlines something vastly deeper.
The believer's argument in Pharaoh's parliament, as decoded by Allama Parwez, operates as a timeless diagnostic blueprint for understanding exactly how societies rise and fall.
Tyrannies, no matter what era they exist in or what technology they possess, rely on the exact same structural mechanics. The subjugation of human beings, the use of religious or ideological theater to mask that subjugation, and the obsessive hoarding of wealth at the expense of human development.
And the most critical takeaway for us to remember is that these oppressive systems do not fall because of magic or supernatural intervention. They fall because of math.
They inevitably collapse under the crushing weight of their own systemic friction. They willingly swallow the arsenic of their own injustice, while their iron curtains of arrogance prevent them from ever seeking an antidote.
This is precisely why the rational alternative proposed in the text is so vital. A society must be governed by universal laws, absolute human equality regardless of gender or lineage, and economic justice where every action has a proportionate natural consequence.
Wealth must be utilized to develop humanity, not to subjugate it.
What I find truly amazing about this text is the enduring conviction of that single believer in the parliament. Even when he is completely cornered by the state apparatus, even when Pharaoh basically threatens him with death and dismemberment for speaking out, his conviction in this rational universal law remains completely unshaken.
The believer's conviction stems from his profound understanding of the limits of Pharaoh's power. He essentially looks at the most powerful tyrant on earth and says, "Your power only extends to my physical body in the short term. You can execute me."
But you cannot execute the mathematical laws of the universe.
Exactly. The systemic laws of cause and effect endure permanently, and despite all your armies, your system is still going to crash.
You can kill me, but you can't stop gravity. That is an incredibly powerful, clear-eyed place to stand in the face of tyranny.
The laws of cause and effect are completely indifferent to a tyrant's threats. The arsenic doesn't care how many monuments you build.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, the obvious question remains, what does this all mean for us today? We don't have literal pharaohs building physical pyramids with forced labor anymore.
But unpacking this 1981 lecture really forces you to take a hard structural look at the systems we do have.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Something for you to mull over as you navigate the modern world. If Allama Parwez's reading of this text is right, if oppressive systems inevitably collapse under the weight of their own natural laws, like a biological organism slowly dying of arsenic poisoning, how do we evaluate the massive, supposedly stable modern economies of today?
That really is the vital diagnostic question for our era.
We look at our modern global landscape, and we see massive, unprecedented disparities in wealth. We see systemic inequalities that seem hard-coded into the algorithms of our financial markets. We see individuals and corporations hoarding resources on a scale that would make ancient pharaohs blush.
It's staggering when you look at the numbers.
So ask yourself, are we truly operating within a rational system of proportionate consequence in human development? Or Are the deep structural inequalities we see right now just the slow-acting arsenic of our own era, quietly accumulating in the system, just waiting to reach the fatal dose?
It is a sobering structural diagnosis to end on, but an absolutely necessary one. Human beings naturally prefer things to be visible and easily categorized. We like the X-ray to show a clean break in the bone so we can simply put a cast on it.
But when the fundamental architecture of the system itself is the poison, the diagnosis requires a much deeper level of courage to face.
Especially when the people running the machine are spending billions on their own Heyman-style PR campaigns to convince you that the poison is actually medicine.
Think about it.